How are you? I'm glad to meet you. Today's topic is the Israelites' 42 campsites in the wilderness, Chapter 2. The author is Abraham Park. The third, before Migdol. Numbers chapter 33 verse 7. Before Migdol is the third campsite. Meaning, Migdol means fortress, military defense facility, or tower, a lookout. This name is derived from gadol, meaning to make great or important, or to make powerful. Location. Migdol was a town located on the northern end of the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 14 verse 2 describes its location as by the sea, before Pi-hahiroth, and in front of Baal-zephon. It was a flat area of seashore large enough for the 2 million people of Israel to camp. The southern end of the Migdol coastline is mountainous. These mountains were very useful as lookout points to detect the movements of the Egyptian army, which is how the name Migdol was derived. Event. Immediately before they crossed the Red Sea, God led the Israelites to Migdol by telling them to turn back, change of direction, Exodus 14:2. The Egyptian army had 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them, Exodus 14:7. The Egyptian army that followed Israel was an elite unit with an organized command structure. Conversely, the Israelites had not received any kind of military training, nor were they armed. Thus, it was simply impossible for Israel to defeat the Egyptians by military force. Lesson. Through the great miracle of parting the Red Sea, however, God saved the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptian army. First, God moved a pillar of cloud to stand behind the Israelite camp. According to Exodus chapter 14 verses 19-20, and the angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus one did not come near the other all night. God caused darkness before the Egyptian camp and it became a fortress, so that they could not attack Israel while the Red Sea parted and the dry land appeared. Second, God parted the Red Sea with a strong east wind. When Moses stretched out the staff in his hand over the sea, God swept the sea back with a strong east wind all night. Exodus chapter 14 verse 21. According to a study by modern scientists, a wind of at least 240 miles, 385 kilometers, per hour would be needed to part the Red Sea. It was only by God's special help that the Israelites were able to safely cross through the divided sea in the midst of such a strong wind. The parting of the Red Sea was a blast from God's nostrils as well as his rebuke. Exodus chapter 15 verse 8 says, "And at the blast of thy nostrils the waters were piled up. The blowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea." 2 Sam 22:16, Psalms 18:15. According to Psalms 106-9, he rebuked the Red Sea and it dried up, and he led them through the deeps, as through the wilderness. Isaiah chapter 50 verse 2, Nahum chapter 1 verse 4. Third, the sea waters became like a wall on the right and left sides, and the land in between the waters became dry. Exodus chapter 14 verses 21-22 says, "So the waters were divided, and the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." Thus, the Israelites walked on dry land through the midst of the sea. Exodus chapter 14 verse 29. It is surely an amazing miracle for the land that was underwater for thousands of years to become suddenly dry. The waters became like walls on the right and left side. Exodus 14:29. The word wall in this verse is homa, in Hebrew, referring to a big city wall, Nahum chapter 3 verse 8. God turned water into a city wall to protect Israel. Psalms 8:13 states, He divided the sea, and caused them to pass through. Fourth, God buried Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. After the Israelites crossed the sea on dry land, the Egyptian army followed them into the sea. Exodus chapter 14 verse 23. God looked down on the army of the Egyptians and brought them into confusion. Exodus chapter 14 verse 24. The word confuse in this verse is hamam in Hebrew, which means to throw into confusion, or to trouble. One of the Bible's versions translates it as, and threw the Egyptian army into panic. Furthermore, God caused the chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with such difficulty that the Egyptians could not chase after the Israelites or flee. Exodus chapter 14 verse 25. When God gathered the waters together again, the waters started flowing and covered Pharaoh and his army. Exodus chapter 15 verse 10. All of the Egyptian army who pursued Israel were buried under the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 14 verse 27, Psalm 78-53. Even Pharaoh's choicest officers were drowned in the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 15 verse 4. The choicest of his officers are the finest of Pharaoh's officers, the best of Pharaoh's officers. Moses and the Israelites highly exalted God for this amazing grace. Exodus chapter 15 verse 1. And Miriam and all the women responded with timbrels and dancing. Exodus chapter 15 verse 20. Just as he had said. God was honored through Pharaoh and all his army and through his chariots and his horsemen. Exodus chapter 14 verse 4. The events that took place before Migdol, the crossing of the Red Sea and the burial of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, were a dramatic triumph of God who alone planned and carried them out by sovereign authority. The Bible testifies that the Israelites finally began to fear the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses after they witnessed this great power of God. Exodus chapter 14 verse 31. It was much the same in the time of Joshua. From the day that they crossed the Jordan River on dry land, the Israelites revered Joshua just as they had revered Moses. Joshua chapter 3 verse 7. Just as the meaning of Migdol implies. There were great events of salvation that proclaimed to all the heavens and the earth that God is our only tower of refuge and a strong fortress on which we can depend. 2 Samuel chapter 22 verse 3, Psalms 11-1. The fourth Marah, Numbers chapter 33 verse 8. Marah is the fourth campsite. Meaning, Marah means bitterness, or a bitter taste. The word is derived from Marah, meaning to be bitter, to be despairing, or to be afflicted. Location. Marah is located about 45 miles, 72 kilometers southeast of Suez, on the coastline of the Red Sea. They camped about 3 days into the wilderness of Shur after crossing the Red Sea. Exodus 15:22. It is known as Ain Hawara today. Event. The Israelites were suffering from thirst because they had no water during their 3 days of marching in the wilderness. After walking without a drop of water for 3 days, they finally found a pool of water. However, the Israelites began to grumble against Moses when they discovered that the water was too bitter to drink. Exodus chapter 15 verse 22. Lesson. When Moses cried out to God in prayer because of the bitter water at Marah, God showed him a tree, Exodus 15:25, and the waters became sweet when Moses threw it into the waters. After solving the problem of the potable water, God gave his statute, Hok, general law, and regulation, Mishpat, legal ordinance, for the first time since the Exodus and tested them to see if they would obey. Exodus chapter 15 verse 25. He promised them that he would be their Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. to those who dispose of all their sinful habits from their life of slavery in Egypt and earnestly heed and obey the statutes and regulations that God commands. Exodus chapter 15 verse 26. The bitter water, like the sufferings, pains, and trials that we encounter on our journey in life, can be turned into sweet water only through Jesus, who is the tree of life. Luke chapter 23 verse 31. The author of this content is Reverend Abraham Park. Reverend Abraham Park was an acclaimed world-class theologian with remarkable pastoral spirituality. He had dedicated his entire life to prayer and the scriptures, having read the Bible over 1,800 times. Throughout his lifetime ministry, he was a true pastor who loved the church and the congregation like his own children. His daily schedule consisted of 2-hour prayers and 3-hour Bible readings, as well as continual preaching and evangelizing. With conviction that to die is to live, he prayed deep in the mountains for 3 years, 6 months, and 7 days. When the sun set, he did nothing but pray. When the sun rose, he did nothing but read the Bible. Then, finally, a single ray of grace shone upon him. Through the powerful illumination of the Holy Spirit and by the grace of God, the scenes in the Bible unfolded like a panorama before his eyes. These scenes were written down on large arrowroot leaves which were bound with a twig. They were later transcribed onto paper bought from a village under the mountain every few months. This is how the Reverend Abraham Park's sermons began. Many people are impressed by the Reverend Abraham Park as follows. How can a person love so many people? How can a person make such a big impact to so many people? He is so hard-working, never rest. He never ceased to pray. He deserves to be truly honored for his dedication for the church and the congregations. A true and faithful worker of God.